Hey there, welcome to That Dang Dad. My name is Phil, and tonight I want to have a discussion about how we read things. Or maybe more accurately, how we ingest other people's words and ideas, particularly on social media. The spark for this discussion came from an interview with China Miéville on a recent episode of the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism podcast. Miéville was promoting his new book about the Communist Manifesto, and when asked about certain interpretations or commentaries on the original work, he expressed some disagreement with this or that argument, but then he mentioned in passing that he was partial to something that he called Sedgwick's concepts of paranoid and reparative readings, and that he didn't think that his disagreements meant that there was nothing to learn from those thinkers that he differed with. Well, those terms, paranoid and reparative reading, really stuck in my head for like days afterwards. I'd never heard them before, but I felt like I was picking up the vibe they were meant to evoke. I found the idea so interesting I decided to track down where they originally came from. Luckily for me, there are numerous PDF copies of the original Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay Is About You. It was first written in 1995. It appeared in a collection of queer fiction criticism in 1997 called Novel Gazing. It was then revised and published in the 2003 collection Touching Feeling. Sedgwick's essay falls somewhere between Sarah Ahmed and Judith Butler in terms of ease of reading, meaning, I'm gonna boil it down for you, but as LeftTube's most lovable himbo, I'm definitely not gonna get it perfect. I'll link to it in the description and you can check it out for yourself. To keep it super short, Sedgwick begins the essay by tracing the history in critical theory, and particularly in queer theory, of what she calls paranoid reading, or the practice of approaching a work, such as a book, an essay, a film, whatever, from a kind of defensive position, keeping your guard up and searching it for evidence of bigotry or violence or bad faith or unintentional harms. And here I want to pause and just say that while paranoia can be a symptom of mental illness or cognitive impairment, Sedgwick takes care in the essay not to pathologize paranoid reading or link it to situations like schizophrenia or dementia. You may argue that she should be using a different term then, but that aside, any critique of paranoia in the essay should not be taken as a criticism of people undergoing mental health situations that produce clinical paranoia. This is also why she and I are using the phrase paranoid position a lot. Because for her, this is a changeable practice as opposed to something more permanent inside of a person. It's easy to understand why cultural critics such as feminists, queer theorists, or anti-colonial scholars would adopt this paranoid position when approaching a work. So much of modern capitalist society has worked to hide its reliance on and preference for patriarchy, queerphobia, and racism. The United States is an empire built on propaganda, built on making sure that its residents either don't know or don't care about the violence and theft that sustains the system. This means that a lot of material produced in the United States and in other places in the imperial core is laced with images and messages and themes that reinforce violence against women, violence against Black and Indigenous people, suppression of working class organizing, and the dehumanization of the queer and the disabled. And when you run into it in, say, a children's cartoon or a fashion article or a video game, it feels bad, man. Obviously, it's painful to discover harmful ideas, especially when you weren't expecting it. Sedgwick outlines several characteristics of the paranoid position, but I want to focus on two. According to the essay, paranoia is anticipatory, and it places its faith in exposure. To our previous point about painful discoveries, paranoid readings can protect us from that. They anticipate that work will be harmful, and thus we can steel ourselves against that. According to Sedgwick, paranoia insists that there be no bad surprises. And I think that's a perfectly understandable impulse. It's the second characteristic that I found very provocative. Paranoia is motivated by the idea that exposing the hidden layers of a work will, do something. Paranoia tells us that if only everyone knew the ideas being stuffed down and repressed inside of the things that we consume, everyone would care about that. They would understand what it means and know what to do about it, and they would ultimately take the appropriate actions. This idea made me think about all the did-you-knowers out there, which I'm qualified to talk about as a longtime did-you-know guy. Particularly in leftist circles, there's a lot of people who gain a lot of fulfillment by letting you know that this or that book, movie, game, band, or artist has some kind of problematic element. Did you know John Lennon was physically abusive to women? Did you know Scar is yet another gay-coded villain? Did you know giving the Wicked Witch green skin is an anti-Semitic trope? And this is not to minimize any harm being actually perpetuated by any works. I only mention it because there's a sense among us did-you-knowers that imparting this knowledge to you is a form of praxis, that the act of knowing something per se has some great effect. And, as Sedgwick notes, sometimes it very much does, but maybe less than we might like to think. I just found that to be a really interesting observation on her part, and something I hadn't really explored in myself before. Anyway, after laying all that groundwork, Sedgwick suggests that there's a kind of opposite position that you could take instead of a paranoid position. A reparative position. A reparative reading would be one that isn't looking for things secretly wrong with a text, but rather one that looks for what a text does well. If a paranoid reading is an attempt to avoid bad surprises and minimize pain, a reparative reading would be one that opens itself up to good surprises and to maximize pleasure. Paranoid readings set the reader up as almost like a opponent of the text, working against it to test it for fault. Reparative readings, in turn, make the reader something of an ally with the text, working with it to learn what it wants to tell them on its own terms and in its own ways. And I want to stress again, there's a reason that Sedgwick keeps using the word position in regard to these readings. For her, this is a practice, a method, a style, a technique someone chooses to apply to a work. We're not talking about a person's personality or their temperament or making a value judgment about their character. This is simply an exploration of the ways that you can engage with something and the possibilities that it might open up one way or the other. When thinking about this, it reminded me of when I was training heavily in Krav Maga. In brief, Krav is a fighting style developed in Israel in the aftermath of World War II. Freedom for Palestine, freedom for Gaza. Designed to be effective in unpredictable hand-to-hand combat as opposed to, say, tournaments or sports or whatever. For example, Krav's most effective, iconic technique is kicking someone in the dick. While talking with an instructor after class one day, I mentioned that one of the techniques that we'd practiced reminded me a little of some other fighting style I'd experimented with, judo or boxing or something. And he told me that actually Krav Maga isn't anything special. They hadn't invented any new moves that no one had ever heard of before. Krav was actually just a grab bag of moves and techniques from other fighting styles that the originators believed worked well together. He told me that Krav was more of a method of training focused on real-world application, and that Krav was always learning from other styles and borrowing what worked and discarding what didn't. That same spirit informs the way I like to study politics and theory. Marx and Engels and Kropotkin have a lot of ideas that feel relevant and powerful to this day, and also some areas that they maybe missed the mark or failed to anticipate. Michael Parenti is a fierce opponent of capitalist imperialism and maybe, in my opinion, shows just a little bit of a soft spot for authoritarian impulses in certain communist governments, maybe? YouTuber Intellectual Media does amazing work talking about black feminism and black history, but her posture towards prison abolition sucks, in my opinion. If I could only learn from people who always got everything right, I'd never learn anything at all. Especially because the more that I learn, the more my sense of what's right kind of drifts here and there. Heck, get into disability studies for 5 seconds and you'll see that a lot of influential thinkers have a huge gap in understanding when it comes to disability. So for me, as I chase down interesting ideas and provocative concepts, I just try to find the nuggets that work for me and discard the rest. Now, of course, there are reasonable limits to this. A couple of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life are legitimately good pieces of advice, but he's such a fascist clown that I would never engage with whatever roads he took that accidentally alighted upon wisdom for a second. And your mileage may vary on what disqualifies someone from being an influence. Mikhail Bakunin, for instance, was a hugely important anarchist thinker. He was also a huge anti-Semite. Maybe you can choose to set that aside and see if he has anything to teach you, and hey, maybe you can't, and that's okay. There will always be another guy with a fucked up beard to read. But anyway, to put a bow on this thing, I want to go back to the moment I heard China Miéville use the phrase reparative reading and talk about the headspace that it put me in. When he used that term, while I gleaned about 90% of the nuance just through context clues, I actually assumed one other characteristic of the reparative position that maybe isn't quite what Sedgwick had in mind. See, I assumed that reparative reading was something that you did not just so that you could learn from a flawed author, but it was something that you did out of a desire to rehabilitate that author's work a little too, as a way to sort of rescue them. I assumed you might adopt a reparative position with somebody who is otherwise a comrade, but who expressed an idea clumsily or incompletely. And it really made me stop and think about how I and people in my political sphere use social media, particularly Twitter. Every day online, it's common to see somebody give the dreaded bad take, and then to see 1,000 people repost that bad take to their friends with some disparaging remarks, or one of those pictures of a guy with a comically, sarcastically huge brain. And I'm sorry to say, many times these bad takes come from people who are otherwise friends and comrades. Or if not that, at least generally within the wider sphere of people that we might consider allies. But man, oh man, if they forgot to include this, or if their words might be construed to mean that, it's time to roast them and make sure that they know they fucked up. And to make sure that everybody else knows that we know they fucked up. And look, it's social media. There's a lot of bad takes out there. And some of them are genuinely harmful and mean-spirited and could influence others to commit harm. Some takes deserve no grace. But it did make me think about whether and how often I was even performing that analysis versus just treating every klutzy take as if it had been made with malice. How often was I trying to excavate all the faults of a take rather than trying to understand or even empathize with the spirit in which that take had been made? And beyond that, I began to wonder whether, as a community, we might gain something if sometimes we chose to adopt a reparative position and literally rescue a bad take rather than shame the author. I'll give you an example. The day that I was writing this script, I saw somebody on Twitter quote tweet an account that was arguing for more walkable cities less reliant on cars. And the quote tweeter's frustrated response was to accuse the original author of not caring about disabled people because otherwise they'd be worried more about accessibility than walkability. Now, I completely get where this responder was coming from. If you're somebody with mobility issues or chronic fatigue for whom vehicular transport is necessary for hauling groceries or whatever, I absolutely see how you might feel like the anti-car crowd isn't considering your individual needs. And if you're disabled or even just anywhere adjacent to disabled activism, you know that disabled people are always an afterthought in politics. They're always expected to make do with the scraps. They're always expected to conform themselves to society rather than have society accommodate them in even basic ways. That would make anyone frustrated. On the other hand, the original author was not a lawmaker proposing actual policy. They were not anyone in a position of power. They were just a random person who was worried about the environment, upset by how car culture makes pedestrians unsafe, and saddened by the destruction of public spaces and marginalized neighborhoods to make room for highways and parking lots. And if you'll allow me the liberty of making an assumption here, the world the disability advocate desires and the world the anti-car person was envisioning are not mutually exclusive. The anti-car person was not centering disabled access in their fantasies, but neither were they proposing anything that would de facto exclude the disabled. Their take was simply incomplete. They had a gap in their awareness, somewhere that they needed to devote some extra thought to. So one could adopt a paranoid position that sees that gap in awareness as evidence of hidden ableism that must be exposed. But one could also adopt a reparative position that sees in that gap a place where learning and even solidarity could occur. One could give a no but, or instead they could give a yes and. And I hope it's clear how careful I'm trying to be not to make a character or value judgment here. Because the last thing that I want to do is make a disabled comrade feel like they are being unreasonable or shrill or divisive, things that people asking for accommodations are virtually always made to feel. Likewise, I don't want to make it seem like disabled activists always have the moral imperative to educate some rando on Twitter. Life under capitalism forces disabled people to waste a ton of energy just fighting to be alive. I know y'all don't always have the spoons for a daily TED Talk. So I bring this up not to call out either side of that Twitter interaction, but rather as something for me to consider as I participate in my own communities. It's a reminder for me to be thoughtful and intentional whether I'm no-butting or yes-anding. And for me personally, this is a call to action in my own self to devote more energy to seeing if I can maybe adopt a reparative position and maybe rescue a few takes here and there. If you're someone with some energy to spare and these concepts intrigue you too, I would invite you to join me in this practice as we enter 2023. Now, in closing, as I researched this topic, I saw some discussion online about how the paranoid reparative reading dichotomy doesn't really hold up and that critical scholarship has moved beyond that. Someone said that Tavia Nyong'o's book Afrofabulations has a much better version of the reparative position. I don't know about all that. Maybe I'm 20 years too late to the party here. But fittingly in the context of reparative reading. I personally find the dichotomy helpful for me as an exercise in reflecting on how I am treating comrades as they express their ideas. In a world of propaganda and capitalist recuperation, by all means, be paranoid about the words and images coming from mass media and political punditry and online influencers. But for me personally, and maybe for you too, I think I maybe need to show a little bit more grace and, frankly, a little more humility when dealing with individuals out on social media. We're all just figuring this out together, and I hope someday when I need rescuing, someone feels like throwing me a lifeline. Anyway, what do you think? Are we too paranoid or not paranoid enough? Do you think that there's value in adopting a reparative position during online discourse, or is that positionality mainly meant to apply to like books and essays and whatever? However you feel about it, to me, one thing is clear. Always adopt the reparative position with my stuff. Every time, no exceptions. Anyway, thank you for joining me tonight. Please hammer down on that YouTube engagement UI, and more importantly, please share this video with somebody that you think might find it interesting. Here's to a fun and fulfilling 2023 together. I'm really looking forward to it. Have a good night.